The northern sky shimmered like liquid glass, a river of green and violet rippling across the midnight heavens. Beneath that ghostly light, the forest was silent, save for the wind whispering through the pines and the soft creak of ice shifting along the fjord. Snow clung to the branches in heavy drifts, muffling every sound, swallowing every trace of life. Yet somewhere within that stillness, a single flame burned. It flickered weakly at first, a fragile ember in the dark, then rose, crackling as resin-fed wood caught the spark. A pyre stood in the clearing, built from the trunks of pine and birch, its smoke curling into the frozen air like a prayer too long unanswered. Before it stood a woman, alone, her cloak heavy with frost, her hair a wild tangle of pale gold that shimmered in the fire's glow. Her eyes, dark and still, reflected the flames as though they had been burning inside her long before the pyre was ever lit. Above her, the ravens circled. 3 of them, black as pitch, their wings cutting through the aurora's light like blades. They did not call out. They only watched. In the old stories, the ravens were Odin's eyes, the watchers of men and gods alike. To see them was to be seen. To defy them was to invite the wrath of the Allfather himself. And yet the woman did not bow her head. She did not speak the prayer that every Norse soul was expected to whisper when the ravens passed. She simply stared back, unflinching, unrepentant, as the firelight danced against her face. Her name was Astrid Eriksdottir. To those who would remember her, she would be called many things: witch, heretic, traitor to the gods. But once, long before her name was whispered in fear, she had been just a fisher's daughter from a windswept village on the edge of the world. Tonight, that world would burn with her defiance. The air was thick with pine smoke and the sharp scent of salt from the nearby sea. Far off, a wolf howled, its voice carried by the wind across the darkened valley. Astrid closed her eyes, listening, not to the wolf, but to the silence beneath it. To the pulse of the earth, the groan of the trees, the quiet heartbeat of the world that existed long before Odin's throne. She remembered the old seeress who once told her, "The gods are only as powerful as the fear we give them." That memory felt distant now, like something heard in a dream. A gust of wind swept across the pyre, feeding the flames. The fire rose higher, crackling, casting wild shadows over the runes carved into the stones at her feet. Each rune told part of her story, carved not by others, but by her own hand. Symbols of rebellion, sorrow, love, and betrayal. The smoke carried the scent of ash and memory, curling skyward as if to challenge the heavens themselves. She reached into the folds of her cloak and drew out a small object wrapped in linen, a pendant carved from bone, its surface etched with the mark of Odin's eye. It had been her father's talisman, once worn with pride during the harvest festivals. For years, she had carried it out of habit, out of fear, out of some fragile connection to the world that raised her. Now, she looked at it as one might look at an old wound. With a steady hand, she threw it into the fire. The flames hissed as the bone cracked, splitting in two. The ravens above shifted, circling closer. Astrid lifted her gaze to them and spoke softly, her voice barely more than breath. "Tell your master," she whispered, "that I am no longer his." The wind fell still, as if the entire forest had paused to listen. Even the flames seemed to waver. A faint tremor rippled through the earth, the kind that only those who still believed in old powers could feel. Somewhere in that silence, a presence stirred, not seen, but felt, like a shadow behind the soul. For the first time, Astrid trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had just done. The aurora above shifted to crimson, bleeding slowly into the horizon. The raven screamed, a harsh, piercing sound that shattered the stillness. Astrid did not move. She watched as they vanished into the northern dark, carrying her defiance into the endless night. Around her, the fire raged higher, consuming the last traces of what she had been. In that burning light, the story began. Long before the sagas were carved into stone, before the poets sang of Odin's victories and Thor's thunder, there were voices that were silenced. Women who dared to question, to curse, to speak against the gods who demanded endless loyalty. Astrid was one of them. Her tale would be buried beneath centuries of conquest and faith, lost to smoke and snow. But legends have a way of surviving in the dark, carried on the wind, remembered by the silence that follows every prayer. As the pyre collapsed in on itself, sending a final column of sparks into the heavens, Astrid stepped back, her figure outlined against the glow. The cold bit into her skin, but her eyes remained steady, distant, unbroken. The snow began to fall again, soft and soundless, settling over the ashes like a burial shroud. Some said the ravens never returned to that forest. Others claimed they still circled there, waiting for the day Odin would claim his vengeance. But those who walked the fjord in the quiet hours of dawn sometimes swore they saw her, a lone woman standing on the cliffs above the frozen sea, her hair whipping in the wind, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Perhaps it was only the light, or perhaps it was the last echo of a story that refused to die. For in the north, where gods once ruled and mortals trembled beneath their gaze, one woman had spoken the forbidden truth, that even the divine could be defied. And as the fire died to embers and the aurora dimmed, her name lingered on the air like a promise, faint, eternal, carried by the breath of the northern wind. In the centuries now buried beneath frost and memory, the north was a world carved from ice and endurance. Mountains rose like the spines of ancient beasts, their peaks hidden behind veils of mist and snow. Fjords cut through the land like deep scars, their waters black and glacial, swallowing the reflections of stars that never warmed the night. The air was sharp enough to wound the lungs, and even in summer, the breath of winter lingered in every shadow. Yet within this cold and merciless realm, life persisted, fierce, proud, and bound to the rhythm of the gods. The Norse called it Midgard, the realm of men. But for those who lived among the fjords and forests, it was more than a place, it was a test. Every sunrise was a victory. Every harvest a prayer answered. The people built their homes close to the sea, their walls thick with timber, their roofs layered with turf to hold back the wind. Smoke curled from their hearths like small offerings to the heavens. Inside, families huddled near the fire, telling tales of gods who walked the earth in the shape of men, of warriors who feasted with Odin in Valhalla, and of spirits that wandered between worlds when the snow fell thick and the moon turned pale. To be born in this land was to be born beneath the eye of the divine. Every storm that shattered the sea was said to be Thor's hammer striking down giants. Every crow on a roof beam was a whisper from Odin himself. The Norse world did not separate faith from existence. Belief was woven into every breath. They did not pray for peace, they prayed for strength. And strength came at a price. Men learned early that survival demanded obedience, to the chieftain, to the clan, to the gods who ruled unseen. Women, though revered as keepers of hearth and bloodline, were expected to serve the same order in silence. The threads of fate, what they called bound all souls to their appointed roles. To defy those threads was to invite chaos, and chaos was the domain of monsters and outcasts. Yet even then, whispers of doubt stirred in the hearts of some, for they saw the world not as a gift from the gods, but as a cage built by them. The rituals that shaped each season were both beautiful and terrible. In spring, when the ice melted and the fjords cracked open like veins, villagers gathered to honor Freyr and Freya, gods of fertility and harvest. Offerings of mead and bread were laid before carved idols, their faces worn smooth by centuries of devotion. But when winter approached and the sun began to fade, darker ceremonies took hold. Cattle were slain to appease Thor's fury. Fires burned through the long nights to keep the frost spirits at bay. And on rare and dreadful nights, human blood was spilled, not from cruelty, but from fear that the gods demanded it. It was said that Odin's hunger for sacrifice was eternal. He had hung himself upon the world tree, Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, to gain knowledge of the runes. From that agony came his power, and from his example, men learned that suffering was holy. Pain became a language through which mortals spoke to their gods. And those who did not bleed for belief were thought to live without meaning. In the long winters, when the world turned silent and the northern lights flickered across the sky, the elders told stories to keep the cold at bay. They spoke of heroes who sailed beyond the edge of the sea to seek glory and death. They spoke of Valkyries who chose the fallen worthy of Valhalla. And always, they spoke of Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, cloaked in shadow, whose wisdom was both salvation and curse. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, flew across the earth each dawn, bringing him news of every mortal's deed. Nothing was unseen. Nothing was forgotten. It was in such a world that Astrid was born. To her people, every gust of wind carried meaning, every omen foretold fate. The North was not a land that forgave curiosity. To question the will of the gods was to stand alone against a storm that had no mercy. Yet, in that frozen silence, Astrid would one day find her voice, a voice that would echo against the laws of both man and God. For now, the land held her story in slumber. Across the fjords, smoke drifted from longhouses where children slept to the sound of their mother's songs, old melodies that spoke of the first dawn, when the world was pulled from ice and chaos. Men sharpened their blades by the firelight, believing that death was not an end, but a calling. The clang of iron against stone mixed with the low hum of prayer, and the scent of smoke mingled with the salt of the sea. The rhythm of Norse life was simple but unyielding. At dawn, men set out to fish or hunt, their longboats creaking over the dark water. By dusk, they returned to their homes, where feasts were held in honor of ancestors and fallen kin. Mead flowed like honeyed fire, and voices rose in song, hymns not of worship alone, but of remembrance. For in this world, memory was sacred. To be forgotten was a fate worse than death. The seeresses or volar walked among them like shadows. Wrapped in furs and crowned with bone charms, they claimed to read the threads of fate spun by the Norns, the three sisters who wove the destinies of gods and men alike. Their words could bless a birth or curse a life. Yet even they bowed before the divine order, never daring to question the justice of Odin's will. Fear was not shouted in the north, it was whispered through the generations. Still, beneath all that reverence and ritual, there was beauty, stark, raw, and eternal. The mountains glowed blue beneath the moon. The fjords reflected the fire of the northern lights. Even the cold, which stole so much life, carried a purity that no southern land could match. It was a place both brutal and holy, a world where the divine felt near enough to touch, and yet impossibly distant. Every sound, every silence in that land had weight. The creak of ice on the sea was a warning. The cry of a raven was an omen. The birth of a child was a pact with destiny. And though the people lived their lives within the framework of faith, there was, beneath it all, a quiet knowing that the gods they worshipped were not gentle. They were mirrors of mankind's hunger, rage, and longing. To serve them was to survive. To resist them was to vanish. But in time, one would rise who refused both fates. She would see the cracks in the myths that held her world together. And in the silence between thunder and prayer, she would begin to wonder whether the gods deserved the fear they demanded. The North, for all its beauty and savagery, was waiting for her. The storm came without warning. The sky, once pale with the light of early dawn, darkened until it was almost black, and the sea turned to iron. Waves crashed against the cliffs with a fury that made even the elders whisper Odin's name in fear. In a small wooden hall on the edge of the fjord, a woman screamed through the wind, clutching the furs around her as the midwife worked beside her. Outside, thunder split the heavens, and lightning struck the sea. When the cries of the newborn finally rose above the storm, the midwife crossed herself with trembling hands and whispered, "Born under Odin's breath." Thus began the story of Astrid Eriksdottir, a child of thunder, destined to walk the edge between faith and defiance. Her father, Eirik, was a fisherman like most men in the village of Stenvik. He was known for his strength and his silence, a man of few words and fewer doubts. He believed that the sea belonged to Njord, that storms were the breath of Thor, and that every life owed something to the gods. Her mother, Brynja, was gentler, a weaver, a singer of old songs. When Astrid cried as a child, Brynja would hum the lullaby of the world tree, Yggdrasil, the one that spoke of roots that reached the underworld and branches that touched the sky. Astrid never forgot that sound. It would return to her years later, like the echo of a memory half buried beneath snow. Life in Stenvik was small and simple but ruled by rhythm. Every morning, the men pushed their longboats into the surf, the wood groaning beneath the weight of nets and hopes. The women tended fires, mended clothes, and smoked fish for the long winter ahead. Children ran barefoot along the frozen shore, their laughter cutting through the salt-laden wind. But beneath that laughter, life was hard. The sea gave, and the sea took, often without mercy. A single storm could leave a family with no father, no brother, no son. And still they prayed. Always they prayed. Astrid's childhood was filled with stories, not the gentle kind that comfort, but the kind that bind a soul in awe and fear. Around the fire, the old seeress, Ingrid, would visit and tell tales of the Allfather's power. She spoke of how Odin plucked out his own eye to drink from the well of wisdom, and how those who defied him were turned to ash by his wrath. The children would shiver and clutch their furs tighter, but Astrid did not. She would lean forward, eyes wide, not in fear, but in fascination. The gods, she thought, were not kind, but they were magnificent. She wanted to understand them, not worship them. By the time she reached her 12th winter, Astrid had already begun to question the world around her. She would stand by the cliffs and stare out across the endless sea, wondering what lay beyond the horizon. The elders said only death and monsters lived there, that the edge of the world fell into the void where Jormungandr, the serpent of Midgard, slept beneath the waves. But Astrid did not believe in endings she could not see. She asked her father once, if Odin made the world, why did he make it so cruel? Eirik had struck her then, not in anger, but in fear. Some questions, he said, are better left for the gods to answer. But the gods never answered. At night, when the storms howled and the sea thrashed against the rocks, Astrid would sneak from her bed and sit by the door, watching lightning split the sky. She imagined Thor's hammer striking the clouds, imagined the gods watching her from above, silent, cold, unmoved. Somewhere deep inside her, a thought began to grow. If the gods were just, they would not demand so much suffering. And if they were unjust, perhaps they did not deserve to be gods at all. Her first act of quiet rebellion came one spring morning. A small calf had fallen sick, and the village priest declared it a sign of the gods' displeasure. He demanded a sacrifice, the blood of a dove, to cleanse the omen. Astrid refused. She took the dove and released it into the forest, letting it fly free into the pale light. The priest called her cursed. Her father made her kneel and pray until her knees bled. But that night, when the moon rose, she looked toward the mountains and smiled. The dove's wings had vanished into the horizon, and the world had not ended. As Astrid grew older, the space between her and the others widened. The girls her age dreamed of marriage and hearths. Astrid dreamed of questions and stars. She learned the art of reading runes from Ingrid, though her father forbade it, saying that such knowledge was not meant for women. She would sit by the firelight, tracing the symbols into the ash, Feho for wealth, and Sus for divine speech, Thurisaz for conflict. But it was the rune kaunin that fascinated her most, the symbol of fire, both creation and destruction. She felt it inside her, the flickering warmth of defiance that neither wind nor fear could extinguish. Sometimes she would follow Ingrid into the forest, where the seeress gathered herbs and whispered to the spirits of the land. There, Astrid learned of things that were never spoken in the longhouse, of old gods forgotten, of the women who once served as Volar, speakers of fate, before the priests of Odin claimed all power for men. The gods demand obedience, Ingrid told her once, but the earth demands balance. One day, child, you will have to choose which voice you listen to. By the time she reached her 16th winter, Astrid's reputation in the village had become both fascination and fear. Some said she could charm the wind, others whispered she brought storms. When her gaze lingered too long on someone, they would cross themselves and mutter prayers beneath their breath. Even her father began to keep his distance, though her mother still looked at her with quiet sorrow, the look of one who knows her child walks a path the world will not forgive. It was during the long dark of winter that Astrid's life began to change. A sickness swept through Stenvik, a fever that took children and elders alike. The priest declared it Odin's punishment for hidden sins. He ordered a blood offering to restore the gods' favor. A goat was not enough. The village chose a man, one of their own, to be given to the pyre. Astrid watched as they bound him in ropes, his wife screaming into the snow. The fire roared, and the priest raised his voice in prayer. But as the man's cries filled the night, Astrid saw no god in the sky. Only the cold, endless dark. That night, she did not sleep. She walked to the edge of the fjord, where the moonlight broke across the ice. The sea was calm again, silent, indifferent. Astrid knelt and touched the frozen surface with her bare hands. "If the gods can watch this," she whispered, "and do nothing, then they are not gods. They are men with louder voices." The words trembled in the air, her breath rising in a ghostly cloud. It was the first prayer she had ever spoken, and the last one meant for the heavens. From that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear that had once kept her quiet began to thaw. The gods had made her world cruel, but she would not be silent within it. Somewhere in the distant forest, a raven called. Astrid lifted her head and met its gaze through the dark. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the bird took flight, its wings slicing across the moon. She felt its shadow pass over her like a mark, not of doom, but of destiny. She did not know it then, but the path she had stepped onto that night would lead her into legend, a path that would one day make her the woman who defied Odin himself. By the time Astrid entered her 17th winter, the world around her had already begun to change, though not in ways that could be seen, only felt. The air seemed heavier, the silence between the waves longer, the prayers louder. Stenvik was a small place, but its laws, like the laws of all Norse villages, were vast and unyielding, older than memory and written not on parchment, but in the hearts of those who feared the gods. To live was to obey. To obey was to survive. Every soul, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, carried invisible chains, chains forged by faith and bound by fear. The hierarchy of their world was as fixed as the constellations above. At its top stood the chieftain, a man who claimed divine right, not because of his wisdom, but because the priests declared it so. Beneath him were the warriors, the keepers of honor, the shield-bearers of the clan. Then came the farmers, the fishermen, the craftsmen, and at the very bottom, the women who held together the silent weight of every home. Each knew their place. Each role was sanctified by ritual. To question one's position was to question the gods who had woven it. Astrid watched these customs with growing unease. She saw her mother rise before dawn each day, tending to fire and loom, her fingers raw from labor, her voice never raised in anger or defiance. She watched the men drink and boast at night, speaking of Odin's glory, of the promise of Valhalla where only warriors feasted in eternity, while women and thralls were left to serve them even in death. To Astrid, it seemed the gods themselves had built a world designed to keep men above and women beneath. But such thoughts were dangerous. They crept like frost across the mind, slow and silent, until one day they shattered everything. The priest of Stenvik, Bjorn the Black, was a man whose power grew from fear. He wore the mark of Odin tattooed into his flesh, and his eyes burned with a fanatic light. His sermons echoed through the longhouse every seventh day, heavy with threats and promises alike. "Those who defy the gods," he would cry, "defy the blood that made them. For we are clay, and Odin is the sculptor." His voice would rise until the walls shook, until even the infants wailed as though sensing the wrath he summoned. Then, when silence fell, he would smile, a thin, knowing smile, and bless the congregation, their faith renewed through trembling. Astrid sat through those sermons, her hands folded, her face still. But inside her mind, a war raged. She did not see gods in Bjorn's words. She saw men using divinity as a weapon. When he declared that the gods demanded offerings of blood, she thought of the faces of those sacrificed, and the silence that followed their deaths. When he spoke of fate, she saw it not as a divine truth, but as a cage built by those who feared freedom. The rituals themselves were a theater of obedience. When the moon reached its peak, villagers gathered by the great stone altar at the edge of the fjord. Torches flickered in the wind, casting orange light over carved idols. Odin with his missing eye, Thor with his hammer, Freya with her cold beauty. They would chant, their voices merging into a single hum that vibrated through the air. Blood, animal or human, would spill onto the stone, and the priest would lift his arms to the heavens, calling for signs. Sometimes, lightning split the clouds, and they called it a blessing. Sometimes, only silence answered, and they called it a test. Astrid stood among them, her breath white in the cold air, watching the faces illuminated by firelight. Fear disguised as faith, that was what she saw. Men trembling at the idea of angering unseen powers. Women praying that their children would be spared. Each person bowed beneath the same invisible weight. And yet, she noticed, the gods never bled for the people. Only the people bled for the gods. One evening, as the priest prepared a ritual for a coming storm, Astrid lingered at the edge of the crowd. The sky had turned the color of ash, and thunder rolled far off over the sea. Bjorn raised a ram's skull in both hands, his voice booming, "Odin Allfather, drink our offering and calm your wrath." He slit the throat of the animal and held it high as the blood streamed down the altar stones. The villagers gasped as lightning flashed across the fjord. They cried out in awe, convinced their offering had been accepted. But Astrid saw something different. She saw coincidence turned into control, fear twisted into faith. That night, she spoke her thoughts aloud for the first time. It was late, the fire low, her mother mending torn linen by its glow. "Do you think Odin truly needs our blood?" Astrid asked quietly. Her mother froze, needle poised in the air. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "Do not speak such words, Astrid. The gods hear everything." Astrid leaned closer. "If they hear everything, then why do they let children die? Why do they demand so much pain for so little mercy?" Her mother's eyes softened with sorrow. "Because that is the way it has always been." Those words sank deep into Astrid's mind, the way it has always been. They echoed through her for days, then weeks. Tradition was a kind of blindness, she realized, passed down like a curse disguised as wisdom. The people clung to their gods because to let go would mean facing the vast emptiness beyond belief, a silence more terrifying than Odin's wrath. In the months that followed, Astrid began to see her world with new eyes. She watched how the laws of men were justified by the laws of gods, how those in power claimed holiness to protect their cruelty. A man could strike his wife and call it divine discipline. A chieftain could take what he desired and name it tribute to the gods. The priest could spill blood and call it sanctified. The gods had become mirrors of mankind's worst impulses, and every act of domination was cloaked in their name. Still, not all faith was hollow. There were moments when Astrid saw true devotion, not born of fear, but of love. The old women who whispered prayers over their dead, the farmers who offered bread to the sea before fishing, the mothers who sang to the stars to keep their children safe, their faith was quiet and pure, untainted by greed. And perhaps that was why Astrid could not yet turn away completely. She did not hate belief itself. She hated what men had done with it. One night, she found Ingrid sitting outside her hut, the old seeress staring into the sky where the aurora rippled like green silk. Astrid joined her without a word. After a long silence, Ingrid spoke. "You've begun to see it, haven't you? The cracks in the world." Astrid nodded. "The gods feel smaller than they once did." Ingrid smiled faintly. "They were always small. It is our fear that made them seem large." Astrid looked up at the stars, cold and endless. "Then why do we still kneel?" "Because," Ingrid said softly, "men fear emptiness more than chains. But some are born to break them." Those words lingered in Astrid's heart long after the old woman's voice faded into the night wind. Somewhere deep inside her, a flame flickered, the same quiet, dangerous spark that had been born the day she let the dove go free. The world was still bound by its ancient laws, still ruled by gods who demanded obedience, still deaf to the cries of those who suffered. But Astrid's heart had already begun to drift beyond the reach of those laws. And though she did not yet know it, her questions, whispered in secret, had already been heard. Somewhere far above, beneath the dark wings of a storm, the ravens stirred. Winter crept upon Stenvik like a living thing, slow and merciless. The sea froze along the edges of the fjord, trapping small boats in still water. The air grew sharp enough to slice the breath from one's chest, and the nights stretched long as eternity. Smoke rose constantly from the longhouses, carrying the scent of pine and animal fat. In those months, the village shrank inward, its people surviving not just the cold, but the silence that came with it. And it was during that silence that the first cracks in Astrid's obedience began to widen. She had always been restless. Even as a child, she wandered further than she should, into forests thick with frost, where the trees whispered like ghosts, or to the shore where the sea muttered in its endless language. But now, at 17, her wandering had become something more deliberate. She sought solitude not to dream, but to think, to question. Each day, she carried water from the frozen stream, her hands burning from the chill, her breath steaming before her. And each day, she asked herself, if Odin truly ruled the fates of men, why did his world feel so cruelly indifferent? The first real test of her faith came on a night of storm and sorrow. A fisherman had drowned, a young man named Torvald, whose laughter once filled the docks. His boat had been found days later, splintered and half buried in ice. The priest declared it a punishment from the gods, claiming Torvald had failed to offer proper tribute before setting sail. Bjorn ordered that his body not be buried near the others, but burned alone, denied the honor of songs. His mother's cries echoed through the village, but no one dared speak against the priest's decree. Astrid did. She waited until midnight, when snow fell like drifting ash and the world was silent save for the groan of wind against timber. Wrapping her cloak tight, she stole from her home and made her way to the pyre that had been set for Torvald outside the village boundary. The wood was stacked high, but the fire had long since died, leaving only a blackened mound of ash and frozen cinders. Astrid knelt beside it, brushing snow from her gloves, and whispered a prayer, not to Odin, nor to any of the gods her people feared, but to the sea itself, which had taken him. "Let him rest where you sleep," she murmured. "Let his soul drift where your waves never freeze." When she stood again, she felt something stir inside her, not defiance, exactly, but clarity. The gods of men seemed far away, but the earth beneath her feet, the wind biting her skin, the stars above her, they were real, and they asked for no blood in return. The next morning, the priest's ravens found the footprints near the pyre. Word spread quickly. Bjorn summoned the villagers to the longhouse, his voice thunderous. "Someone has disturbed the sacred ashes," he roared. "The gods will not forgive such trespass." His eyes scanned the crowd, sharp and predatory. "If any among you know who defied their will, speak now, or share in the curse that will fall upon us." No one spoke. But Astrid felt the weight of her mother's gaze. It was not accusation, only fear, fear that her daughter's quiet boldness might one day doom them both. When Bjorn's eyes passed over her, she met his stare without flinching. For a heartbeat, something passed between them, not fear, but recognition. He saw it in her, a mind that would not bend. And he knew then that this girl, if left unchecked, would one day challenge everything he stood for. After that day, Astrid noticed the way Bjorn watched her. At first it was from a distance, a passing glance during gatherings, a shadow near the edge of her vision when she walked through the village. But as winter deepened, so too did his scrutiny. He began to ask her questions masked as sermons. "Do you believe the gods test us through hardship, Astrid?" he'd ask before the crowd. "Or do you think men bring their own misfortune?" His tone was calm, but his eyes burned with hunger, the hunger of a man desperate to expose blasphemy. Astrid answered carefully. "I think the gods test men through silence," she said once, "and men fail the test when they mistake silence for approval." A few of the villagers murmured. Bjorn's jaw tightened, but he smiled thinly. "A clever tongue can lead the soul astray," he said. "Pray that yours finds its way back." It might have ended there, a quiet duel of words, had it not been for the winter famine. The fishing nets came up empty. The stores of grain dwindled. Children cried from hunger while men sharpened their knives in frustration. The priest declared it was Odin's punishment for hidden sins among them. "The All-Father demands sacrifice," Bjorn announced one evening, his voice echoing through the longhouse. "A blood offering to cleanse our shame." Astrid felt the air leave her lungs. She had heard stories, whispered tales of what happened during such times. In the old ways, when crops failed and storms raged, the village would offer a life to appease the gods. Sometimes an animal. Sometimes thought. The people murmured in fear, some nodding, others shaking their heads. Then Bjorn's eyes landed on her again. Not directly, but deliberately enough for the others to notice. That night, Astrid sat awake by the dying fire, her mother asleep beside her. She could not close her eyes. The storm outside howled like the cries of the drowned. Ingrid's words came back to her. Some are born to break the chains. But what did it mean to break them? To speak against a priest was to risk death. To defy the gods was to invite madness. Yet silence felt worse, a betrayal not of faith, but of truth itself. The next morning, Astrid climbed the cliff above the fjord where the wind screamed like a living beast. The world stretched vast before her, the gray sea, the endless snow, the black line of forest beyond. She closed her eyes and whispered, "If you are there, Odin, show me. If you demand blood, take mine. But if not, let me see the truth." The wind shifted suddenly, sharp and cold, and for a moment she thought she heard a whisper in it, not words, but something like laughter. She opened her eyes. Far below, 2 ravens circled the shoreline, black wings cutting through the snow. When she returned to the village, Bjorn was waiting. He stood in the center of the path, flanked by 2 men with torches. "You went to the cliffs," he said, his tone casual but his eyes gleaming. "The gods saw you." Astrid said nothing. Bjorn stepped closer. "Careful, girl. Curiosity can become heresy. And heresy burns hotter than any winter fire." She met his gaze once more. "Then let it burn." He smiled then, slowly, coldly, as though he had been waiting to hear those very words. The next sacrifice, he declared, would be chosen by Omen. And that was how Astrid's name first found its way into the priest's mouth, not yet as an accusation, but as a prophecy. The snow had turned to sleet by the time the omens were cast. Stenvik gathered at the edge of the fjord, where the ice cracked and groaned beneath the priest's feet. Bjorn the Black stood before the stone altar, his cloak whipping in the wind, his voice rising above the storm as he invoked the Allfather's name. Around him, the villagers knelt, huddled shapes wrapped in furs, their faces pale and gaunt from hunger. The air smelled of smoke and salt and dread. This was not faith. This was desperation wearing the mask of devotion. Astrid stood at the edge of the crowd, her breath steady but her heart pounding. She watched as Bjorn drew runes into the snow with a carved bone. Each line gleamed faintly, dusted with ash and blood. He whispered over them in the old tongue, calling for signs from beyond, for Odin's judgment to fall upon the one whose spirit had displeased the gods. The people waited, eyes wide with fear. Even the ravens had gone silent, perched upon the stones like dark sentinels. Then Bjorn lifted his gaze to the heavens and threw the runes into the wind. They scattered, spinning wildly before landing on the frozen ground. The priest knelt to read them. A murmur rippled through the crowd as he froze, his gloved fingers trembling over the markings. He turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. And then, with deliberate calm, he said her name. "Astrid." The sound of it cut through the air like a blade. For a moment, no one moved. The wind itself seemed to still. Astrid felt the weight of 100 eyes fall upon her, each gaze heavy with pity, horror, or quiet relief that it was not them. Her mother gasped, clutching her hand, whispering a prayer that died on her lips. The priest's voice rose again, louder now, triumphant. "The gods have spoken. Their wrath is upon us, and she shall be their offering." Astrid's heart thundered, but she did not look away. "You would sacrifice me because your nets came up empty?" she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Because your prayers failed?" Bjorn's face twisted. "Because you have turned from the gods. Your doubt has poisoned our faith. The All-Father demands your blood to cleanse what your pride has stained." She took a step forward. "And how convenient for you, priest, that it is always someone else's blood that keeps your gods fed." A shocked murmur spread among the villagers. The first hint of something dangerous, thought. Bjorn sensed it too. His voice hardened. "Blasphemy," he hissed. "You mock what gives your people life." "Life?" she said bitterly. "You call this life? We live in fear, we starve in silence, and you say the gods bless us? No, Bjorn. They bless you. They bless those who speak in their name." Bjorn raised his staff. the carved serpent coiled around its length glinting in the firelight. "Enough," he bellowed. "By Odin's will, you are condemned. The ritual shall be performed at dusk." The crowd recoiled. Astrid's mother threw herself to the ground, begging, but the priest ignored her. Two men seized Astrid by the arms, men she had known since childhood, their faces blank with guilt and fear. She did not fight. There was no point in struggle now. But as they dragged her toward the longhouse, she looked to the cliffs beyond the fjord, where the wind tore through the sky. Somewhere, she thought, the gods were watching. And if they were, she would not let them see her kneel. They locked her in a small hut near the edge of the village, once used for storing nets and dried fish. The air inside was damp and cold, and the only light came from a crack in the wall where snow blew through. She sat in silence, listening to the storm outside and the faint sound of drums being prepared. Each beat echoed like a heartbeat, the heartbeat of the village, still ruled by fear. In that silence, her thoughts turned inward. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what was to come. Death no longer frightened her. It was the injustice that burned. To die for questioning cruelty, that was not divine will. That was tyranny cloaked in holiness. And yet, beneath her anger, a strange calm began to form. She thought of Ingrid's words, "Men fear emptiness more than chains." Perhaps that was what this truly was, a test not from Odin, but from herself. Hours passed. At some point, the door creaked open and a figure slipped inside. Ingrid stood there, her cloak soaked, her eyes bright in the darkness. "I told you the cracks would widen," she whispered. "They have," Astrid said softly. "And now they'll bury me in them." Ingrid knelt beside her, placing a trembling hand on her cheek. "Listen to me, child. The gods men worship are only half the truth. There are others, older, quieter, who do not demand blood but remember those who suffer it. If you go to that altar tonight, go with your eyes open. Do not pray to Odin. Pray to the wind, to the sea, to whatever still listens. Sometimes the world itself chooses who it keeps." Astrid met her gaze. "And if it chooses not to keep me? Then you will still have defied them," Ingrid said, her voice breaking. "And that, too, is a kind of immortality." She pressed something into Astrid's hand, a small pendant shaped like a spiral, carved from driftwood. "Keep this close. It belonged to my mother, who defied a priest before you. They burned her, but her name still lives. Remember, fire cannot destroy truth. It only makes it seen." Then Ingrid was gone, swallowed by the storm once more. When the door opened again, it was not the old woman who stood there, but Bjorn. The priest entered slowly, his shadow filling the narrow space. "You had a chance to repent," he said. "Instead, you speak of storms and spirits." Astrid held his gaze. "And you speak for gods who never answer." He smiled, not with kindness, but satisfaction. "You'll learn their voice before the end." She leaned forward, her voice low. "No, priest. Before the end, it is you who will learn silence." Bjorn's smile faded. He turned and left without another word. By dusk, the storm had calmed, leaving behind a strange stillness. Torches flickered in the dark as the villagers gathered once more by the fjord. Astrid was led to the stone altar, her hands bound with rope, her cloak stripped away. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs, but she stood tall, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Bjorn lifted his staff and began to chant, the ancient words echoing through the valley. As the final phrase left his lips, thunder rolled across the mountains, deep, long, and distant. The ravens screamed and took flight, swirling above the altar in a black spiral. The villagers gasped, falling to their knees. Even Bjorn hesitated, his voice faltering. Astrid closed her eyes and whispered to the wind, "If you are real, show me that you are not his." The thunder answered again, louder this time, so loud it shook the stones beneath them. The sky split open, a crack of lightning striking the far end of the fjord. The fire went out. Darkness swallowed the world. When light returned, Astrid was still standing, unburned, unbroken, while Bjorn knelt before the shattered altar, blood trickling from a cut across his brow. The villagers stared in silence, fear and awe warring in their faces. Astrid looked up into the storm, her voice steady. The gods you worship have fallen silent. Perhaps it is time we learn to listen to something else. And though no one moved, something had already shifted. The chains had not yet broken, but they had begun to rust. The storm that night marked a turning, though few in Stenvik would dare say it aloud. In the days that followed, the air felt charged, as if something unseen still lingered over the fjord. The lightning strike had shattered the altar stone clean through, leaving black veins of glass running through its surface. The priest claimed it was a sign of Odin's anger, a warning against doubt. Yet even as he spoke, the villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered that the lightning had struck for Astrid, not against her. Others swore they had seen her stand untouched amid the firelight, her eyes calm while Bjorn bled at the foot of the god's own altar. Bjorn tried to regain control. He gathered the people in the longhouse, his voice hoarse from shouting. "This is a test," he declared. "A trial for our faith. The All-Father struck because we hesitated, because we let her voice infect our hearts." He paced before the fire, wild-eyed, his hair matted from sleepless nights. "We must rebuild the altar. Offer again. Only then will the storm's curse lift from us." But his words did not fall as heavily as before. Something in the people had shifted. Fear had not vanished, but it had changed shape, from submission to suspicion. They still feared the gods, but now they feared their priest as well. Astrid was released the next morning. Bjorn could not risk further resistance. Too many had begun to question his judgment. Her mother met her at the edge of the longhouse, tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling as she reached to touch her daughter's cheeks. Astrid said nothing. There were no words large enough to hold what she felt: relief, exhaustion, quiet fury. The ropes had left marks on her wrists, but her spirit felt strangely light, as if the storm had carried away her fear. For a few weeks, life in Stenvik returned to its fragile rhythm. The nets were repaired. Fires burned again in the hearths. The sea, once frozen and still, began to move, slow waves returning under gray skies. The famine eased slightly when a school of fish was found trapped near the shallows. Many called it a blessing, proof that Odin had been appeased. But others quietly credited Astrid. They did not say it aloud, but she saw it in their eyes, gratitude mixed with wonder, the kind reserved for things both feared and revered. Bjorn saw it too, and it poisoned him. His sermons grew darker, his threats sharper. He spoke often of false prophets, of women who speak with tongues of ice. He reminded them that pride was the devil's first gift to mankind. Yet every time he looked at Astrid, he saw that her silence spoke louder than any sermon. She no longer bowed her head during prayer. She no longer flinched at his invocations. And worse, others had begun to imitate her quiet defiance. It was Ingrid who came to her one evening, bringing herbs wrapped in cloth and a whisper of danger. The old seeress's face was pale beneath the firelight. "He means to destroy you," she said simply. "He sees you as a crack in the dam. If you are not silenced, everything he has built will crumble." Astrid's voice was calm. "Then let it crumble." Ingrid shook her head. "You don't understand. Men like Bjorn don't surrender their power, they consume it. If he cannot prove the gods favor him, he will make them favor him through blood. Yours if he can." Astrid looked toward the door, where the wind moaned softly. "Then I will not let him be the only one who speaks for the gods." The next morning, she went to the cliffs where the lightning had struck. The air still smelled faintly of burnt stone and salt. She knelt by the broken altar, running her fingers along the jagged edges. There, lodged within a crack, was something small and black, a shard of glass fused by the storm. She picked it up and held it to the light. Within its surface, she thought she saw movement, not reflection, but a shimmer like the flicker of wings. That night, she dreamed of ravens. They filled the sky, their wings blotting out the stars, their voices whispering in a language older than men. She stood among them, her hair whipping in the wind, and in the dream one of them spoke, not in words, but in meaning. "You have been seen." She awoke to silence, her breath sharp in her chest. In her hand, she still clutched the shard. Word of strange things began to spread. The fishermen claimed they saw shapes circling above the water, two great birds that followed Astrid whenever she walked by the shore. Children said they heard voices in the wind when she passed. Some called her blessed. Others called her cursed. Bjorn called her chosen by demons. He began to preach that the storm had corrupted her, that Odin's lightning had marked her as a vessel of chaos. "The gods have many faces," he said, his voice booming through the longhouse. "Some fair, some foul. Beware those who claim to speak truth while the sky still remembers their defiance." But the people no longer listened as they once had. They nodded, yes, but quietly, uncertainly. And when Bjorn's eyes turned away, they looked to Astrid. One afternoon, as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks, Astrid stood at the water's edge. Children gathered near her, tossing pebbles into the waves. She told them a story, not of Odin or Thor or Freya, but of the sea itself. "The sea is older than the gods," she said softly. "It has seen them come and go, like waves that rise and fall. The gods are born from men's fear. The sea has no fear, and so it endures." Ingrid watched from a distance, smiling faintly. "You've become what he fears most," she murmured to herself. "A voice that cannot be chained." That night, Bjorn entered the hall alone. His shadow stretched long across the floor as he approached the half-broken idol of Odin that still stood near the fire. He stared into its carved eyes, hollow and cracked, and whispered, "If you still rule, strike her down. Show them you are not dead." But no wind stirred. No fire flared. Only silence answered him. He struck the idol once with his staff. The wooden head split open and fell into the ashes. By dawn, the ravens were back, circling high above the village. The people woke to find one of them perched on Astrid's roof, the other watching from the altar ruins. Some knelt in fear. Others felt a strange calm. They began to speak of her in hushed tones, the girl the storm spared, the one the ravens guard. Astrid herself said nothing. She simply lived, mending nets, tending fires, walking the cliffs. But in her heart, she knew something had changed forever. The gods were not gone, but they were no longer untouchable. And though Bjorn still preached, his voice no longer filled the air. It only echoed within it, hollow and fading. As winter melted into spring, Astrid often stood where the snow met the sea and felt the tide pull against her boots. The world, once so small, now seemed vast again, dangerous, uncertain, but free. She did not know yet what role she would play in the story the gods had begun to rewrite. But she knew this: the storm had not ended that night. It had only moved inside her. Spring came late that year, creeping into Stenvik like a hesitant visitor. The snow receded slowly, revealing earth that had forgotten warmth. The sea thawed first, dark, restless, whispering against the rocks. With it came birds, their cries sharp against the cold air, and the faint scent of life returning. But beneath that renewal lay unease. The village lived in two worlds now, one ruled by the priest's old faith, and one drawn toward something nameless that Astrid had awakened. The people spoke differently. Some still muttered Odin's name over their morning bread, but others began to whisper words of their own, quiet prayers to the sea, to the wind, to the lightning that had spared the girl. No one called it rebellion. Not yet. But the silence between Bjorn's sermons had grown louder than his voice. Astrid felt that silence too. She could sense it when she walked through the fields, when the villagers greeted her with wary smiles, when the ravens followed her at a distance, two dark wings always overhead. She had not called them, yet they remained. At times, she almost forgot they were there, until one would cry out, low and mournful, and the sound would echo through her bones. Ingrid visited her often. The old seeress walked with a limp now, but her mind burned brighter than ever. "They're afraid of you," she said one afternoon as they sat by the cliffs, watching the sun struggle through gray clouds. "Not because they think you'll curse them, but because you've shown them the gods can bleed." Astrid watched the horizon. "If the gods bleed, then they're not gods." "Exactly," Ingrid said softly. "And that's what terrifies them. Not that you defied Odin, but that you lived after doing it. You've broken the spell of fear. That's more dangerous than any blade." Astrid turned the driftwood pendant between her fingers, tracing the spiral carved into it. I didn't mean to start anything. No one ever does, Ingrid replied. But stories choose their vessels. Once spoken, they move on their own. Ingrid's words proved true sooner than either expected. That summer, travelers arrived from the south, traders seeking iron and furs, bringing with them news of raids, kings, and omens. They spoke of temples burned by lightning, of priests who vanished during storms, of strange voices heard across the northern seas. The people of Stenvik listened, wide-eyed, and when Astrid passed among them, their gazes lingered longer than before. Some looked with reverence, others with suspicion, but all with curiosity. Bjorn heard the whispers too. They spread like smoke, slipping through the cracks in his sermons. His temper grew short, his prayers louder, more frantic. He began fasting, locking himself in the longhouse for days, emerging hollow-eyed and trembling. The villagers avoided him now. His once commanding voice had become a broken instrument, a reminder of something dying. One night, Astrid saw him alone on the beach. The moon cast his shadow long across the sand. He was on his knees before the water, clutching his staff, muttering prayers that dissolved into sobs. She almost pitied him. Almost. When he saw her, his face twisted with something between hatred and despair. "You've stolen them from me," he hissed. "Their hearts, their faith. You think the gods favor you? You think the storm was mercy?" Astrid's voice was calm. "I think the storm was truth. And truth doesn't need favor." Bjorn stood, staggering slightly. "You've brought ruin. The gods demand balance. For every defiance, a reckoning must come." "Then let it come," she said quietly. "I no longer live in their shadow." He pointed his staff at her, his hand shaking. "You will. All who forget the gods will." He left her standing in the wind, but the threat clung to the air like frost. The next day, the first sign appeared. One of the ravens was found dead near the well, its body untouched, its black feathers splayed like ink on snow. The villagers whispered that it was an omen. Some said the gods had struck it down to show their wrath. Others believed Bjorn had done it, to twist the signs to his favor. Astrid buried the bird by the sea, her hands trembling as she pressed the earth down. The remaining ravens circled above, silent. That night, dreams returned. This time, she stood not beneath the storm, but within it. The sky was alive with fire and wind, and she saw the faces of the old gods, Odin's single eye burning like a star, Thor's hammer descending through clouds, Freya's tears turning to glass. But their shapes wavered, dissolving into shadow. A voice, neither male nor female, whispered through the gale, "They are fading. And when they fall, what will rise in their place?" She woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The hut was silent, save for the soft flutter of wings. The remaining ravens sat on the windowsill, watching her. In its eyes she saw not malice, but something ancient, waiting. The next morning, Ingrid found her by the water. "You've been marked again," the old woman said. "The gods never let go easily." Astrid shook her head. "I don't belong to them." "Maybe not. But you've become part of something larger than them, the space they leave behind." Later that week, Bjorn summoned the village once more. He stood before the broken altar, his robes tattered, his voice trembling but fierce. "You think the gods have fallen silent? They are only gathering strength. The false prophet walks among us still, and her shadow poisons the air. Tonight, we purify Stenvik. Tonight, we burn her heresy from our hearts." No one moved. The villagers looked from Bjorn to Astrid, who stood at the edge of the crowd, calm as the sea. The priest's voice cracked with desperation. "You fear her more than you fear the gods. Do you not see what she is?" A fisherman spoke softly, "We see what she is. She's one of us." A ripple went through the crowd. Bjorn's face drained of color. He raised his staff, but no one stepped forward to follow. The power that had once filled his voice was gone, absorbed by the murmurs of the living. Astrid took a step closer. "You taught us that the gods demand blood," she said. "But maybe the gods are only as cruel as the men who speak for them." Bjorn's hand trembled. "You will destroy us all." "Maybe," Astrid said, her eyes soft with pity. "Or maybe we were already destroying ourselves, one sacrifice at a time. The priest's staff slipped from his grasp and fell into the dirt. The sound echoed louder than any sermon. That night, the village did not gather to burn, nor to pray. They stayed in their homes, silent, listening to the wind move through the valley. The ravens cried once, a long, low call that faded into the sea. And for the first time in living memory, no fire burned upon the altar of Stenvik. Autumn descended quietly upon Stenvik, wrapping the village in a shroud of gold and gray. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and salt, and the sun dipped lower each day, lingering just long enough to paint the sea in burnished light before vanishing behind the fjords. The people moved more slowly now, weary from the year's strange events. The lightning, the priests unraveling, the dead raven. But beneath their fatigue was something new, a sense of release. The weight that had once pressed upon their hearts had lifted, leaving room for a silence that did not frighten them anymore. Astrid lived apart still, in her small hut near the cliffs, but the distance between her and the others no longer felt like exile. They brought her food without being asked, smoked fish, loaves of dark bread, small bundles of herbs, and when they passed her on the paths, they greeted her with quiet respect. Children sometimes followed her at a distance, laughing softly as she walked with the remaining raven perched on her shoulder. She no longer dreamed of storms or blood. Instead, she dreamed of the sea, calm and endless, its surface glimmering with strange lights that seemed to beckon her deeper. Ingrid's health was failing. The old seeress spent more time by the fire, her eyes clouded with mist but her voice steady as ever. Astrid visited her daily, bringing water and tending the fire. On one such visit, Ingrid took her hand and whispered, "The world is changing. The old gods are dying, Astrid. But death is not the end, it's the space between stories." Astrid nodded, though she did not fully understand. "What comes after them?" Ingrid smiled faintly. "That depends on what we remember. Every story you speak keeps something alive. Every silence buries something forever." For several nights after, Astrid sat by the cliffs, watching the northern lights bloom across the sky. They shimmered like ghosts of a forgotten realm, bending and twisting in colors no mortal tongue could name. She began to hum beneath her breath, not songs of worship, but the lullabies her mother once sang in the long winters. The raven listened, its head tilted, as if the melody stirred something ancient within it. One morning, the sea brought a visitor. A longship appeared in the distance, its sail torn, its oars moving sluggishly through the gray waves. The villagers gathered on the shore, watching as it drifted closer. When it finally ran aground, 3 men stumbled onto the beach, gaunt, salt-streaked, eyes wide with exhaustion. Their leader was a tall man with a scar across his cheek and a chain of bronze at his neck. He fell to his knees before the villagers and said, "We come from the south, from the ruins of Uppsala. The great temple is gone. Fire took it." The gods did not answer. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. News of Uppsala, the heart of the old faith, struck like a blade. Bjorn, who once would have stood tall at such a moment, was nowhere to be found. Some said he had gone into the mountains to seek the gods. Others whispered he had thrown himself into the sea. The strangers were given food and shelter, and as they rested, they told more, of temples burned by lightning, of seers who vanished, of idols crumbling into dust. "The age of the gods is ending," one said bitterly. "And men tear each other apart, trying to hold onto their shadows." Astrid listened in silence. That night she walked alone to the edge of the water. The tide whispered against the rocks like a secret too old to be spoken. She felt neither joy nor sorrow, only the vast stillness of understanding. The gods had not been slain by men's hands or vengeance. They had withered, quietly, as men stopped believing in fear. The raven fluttered down beside her, its feathers catching the moonlight. "You've seen the end of them," Ingrid's voice came to her memory. "Now you must decide what begins in their place." The next morning, Astrid began to carve. She took driftwood from the shore and shaped it with a small iron blade. The villagers watched her, curious. She carved not idols, but figures, human ones, men and women standing side by side, hands raised to the sky, eyes open. Each face was calm, unadorned. When she was done, she placed them near the edge of the village where the grass met the sea. A young boy asked her, "Who are they?" She smiled. "They are us." Word spread quickly. People began to visit the wooden figures, not to worship, but to sit nearby and speak softly of their families, their fears, their dead. They left small offerings, not in tribute but in remembrance. It was not religion. It was memory, shared and reshaped. The gods had demanded obedience. These new totems asked only to be remembered. Weeks passed, and the village changed in quiet ways. The altar that once stood at the square was taken down, its stones repurposed for a communal hearth. The songs once sung for Odin and Thor faded, replaced by softer chants that carried no name. The people learned to live with their uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, they found peace. One evening, as the first snow began to fall, Ingrid called Astrid to her side. The old woman's breath was shallow, her eyes distant. "It's time," she whispered. "You must take the light from me now." Astrid knelt beside her, tears gathering in her eyes. "I don't know what to do without you." "You'll do what you've always done," Ingrid murmured, smiling faintly. "Listen to what the world is trying to remember." She died with her hand in Astrid's, the fire casting her face in gold. The raven cried out once, sharp and low, then went silent. Astrid buried her at dawn, near the cliffs where the wind was strong. The villagers came, placing stones upon the grave, each one whispering a wish or a memory. When it was done, Astrid stood before them and said softly, "We are not bound by gods or oaths anymore. We are bound by each other. That is enough." No one spoke, but many nodded. The sea roared in answer. That night, as Astrid returned to her hut, she saw the northern lights again, brighter than before, spreading across the sky like a living tapestry. She felt a warmth in her chest, something like gratitude, or maybe peace. For the first time, she understood that defiance had never been about anger. It had been about love. Love for life, for truth, for the freedom to shape one's own story. The raven landed beside her and let out a soft sound, almost like laughter. Astrid looked out over the sea and whispered, "Then let this be the beginning." In the morning, she was gone. The villagers found her hut empty, the door open, the fire burned low. Her footprints led to the cliffs, and stopped at the edge. They searched the shore but found nothing, only the raven circling overhead. In time, they began to say that she had walked into the sea and become part of the waves, carried into the next story the world would tell. And when the wind howled through the fjords in winter, they swore they could still hear her voice in it, calm, steady, unafraid. Winter returned with a quiet fury, cloaking the world in white and stillness. The sea froze along the shallows, sealing the shore in a jagged crust of ice. Stenvik stood half-buried beneath snowdrifts, its roofs bowed under the weight. Smoke curled from the chimneys, thin and pale against the gray sky. The villagers moved carefully, their voices hushed, as if unwilling to disturb the silence that now ruled their world. It was a different silence than before, not the fearful stillness of a people bound by gods, but the solemn quiet of a world learning to breathe again. Astrid's disappearance had left a hollow space in the village, not a wound, but an echo. Her hut remained untouched, the door sealed against the wind. Some said she had become one with the sea, watching over them from beneath the waves. Others believed she had followed the old paths into the mountains, where the gods once walked. No one knew the truth and no one needed to. Her story had already woven itself into theirs, becoming something larger than memory. Each evening, the villagers gathered by the communal hearth, the same stones once used for the altar, and told stories. Some spoke of Astrid's defiance, of how she had stood against Odin's will and lived. Others told simpler tales, of her laughter, her kindness to children, the way she looked at the sky as though it might answer her. The raven still visited, perching on the roof beams, listening in silence. It never allowed anyone near, but it never left the village either. To the people of Stenvik, it was no longer a sign of death, but a keeper of stories. The children grew up hearing her name before they learned the names of the gods. They carved small wooden figures like hers and placed them in their homes, not idols, but reminders that courage could exist without temples. Even Bjorn's name became a whisper of the past. A fisherman claimed to have seen him once, far to the north, living among hermits who spoke to no one. Whether true or not, no one sought him. The world had shifted, and he had been left behind in the turning. One evening, an old traveler arrived at the village gates, wrapped in furs stiff with frost. His beard was white as snow, his eyes sharp despite his years. He carried no weapons, only a small satchel of scrolls. The villagers took him in, fed him broth and bread, and asked where he had come from. "From the south," he said, "from lands where the temples have fallen. I am a keeper of tales. I gather what the gods have forgotten." When he heard Astrid's story, he listened for a long time without speaking. Then he said softly, "There are others like her, in villages far and wide. Women and men who have stood against the old fear. It is as if the world itself has grown weary of kneeling." He stayed for many nights, recording their stories by the firelight. When he left, he bowed to the villagers and said, "What you have here will not die. Stories such as these outlive the gods." As winter deepened, the storms came more fiercely. The sea roared against the cliffs, waves tall as towers breaking into foam. Yet no one feared the thunder anymore. When lightning split the sky, the children ran to the windows to watch, laughing at the flash. The sound that once meant wrath now meant wonder. Ingrid's grave became a place of quiet pilgrimage. People came not to pray, but to sit and think. They would leave stones there, each one etched with a word: truth, freedom, memory, hope. Over time, the hill of stones grew, rising like a small altar of meaning. Snow covered it each winter, but when spring came, the words reappeared, dark against the melting white. The raven watched from above. Sometimes, at dawn, it would fly out to sea and return at dusk with salt on its wings. It perched upon the highest roof in the village and stared toward the horizon, as though waiting for something unseen. One night, the northern lights returned, brighter and wilder than any had ever witnessed. The sky rippled with green and violet fire, spilling across the world like a curtain of living flame. The villagers gathered outside, their faces bathed in shifting color. For a long time, no one spoke. Then an old woman said, "It's her." And no one disagreed. They watched the lights dance until dawn, and when the last shimmer faded, the village felt changed again. It was as though something had passed over them, not divine, but deeply human. The next day, they began carving new runes into the wood of their homes. Not the names of gods, but symbols of their own choosing: spirals for unity, waves for change, suns for remembrance. It was a new language, born not from fear, but from belonging. Seasons turned. Children grew into storytellers. The world beyond Stenvik shifted too, as word of their village spread, a place where no gods ruled, where men and women lived by truth and memory alone. Travelers came to listen, to learn. Some stayed. Others carried the stories onward, and in each retelling, Astrid's name took root in new soil. Years later, when the old generation had faded and new ones filled their place, people still spoke of the Storm Maiden, the woman who defied Odin and lived. They said she had not vanished at all, but walked the world still, her spirit moving through the wind and the sea, guiding those who dared to question. And sometimes, on nights when the sky burned green and the waves whispered like voices, they swore they could hear her laughter carried on the wind, soft, knowing, eternal. The raven, older than any could count, still lingered. It had lost some feathers, its wings heavy, but its eyes remained sharp. One morning, it perched atop the stone hill and let out a cry so long and haunting that every villager paused to listen. Then it spread its wings and flew toward the horizon, higher and higher, until it vanished into the sun. No one saw it again. But after that day, whenever the sea glimmered at twilight, people said they saw two shadows circling above the waves, a woman's shape and a bird's, bound together in the endless wind. And so Stenvik endured, no longer a place of gods, but of stories. The temple was gone, the priest forgotten, yet something greater had taken root, a quiet kind of faith, built not on power, but on remembrance. The villagers had learned that eternity does not belong to the divine. It belongs to those who live and remember and tell. Spring came again, softer than any the villagers could remember. The air was filled with the scent of thawing earth and pine sap, and the sea broke free from its frozen skin with a sound like deep breathing. Birds returned to the cliffs, building their nests among the stones where Astrid had once walked. Life moved forward, quiet but unbroken. Stenvik had become a place of calm endurance, where the days blended gently into one another and the past lived not as a burden, but as a companion. The wooden figures Astrid had carved still stood near the shore, though wind and rain had softened their edges. Moss clung to their feet, and salt had faded their grain to silver. The children played among them, tracing the carved hands, the simple faces, whispering stories that had grown from imagination and inherited memory. Each story changed slightly in the telling. Sometimes Astrid was a mortal woman, other times a spirit of the sea, and in a few tales, she was the storm itself, wandering the world in human form. None of the versions were entirely true, but each one carried her essence: courage born from defiance, peace born from understanding. One morning, a ship appeared on the horizon, not the rough longships of raiders, but a smaller vessel, sleek and curved, with sails dyed the color of pale smoke. The villagers gathered on the shore as it approached, wary but curious. The sailors who stepped ashore were strangers, traders from distant coasts, their speech slow and foreign. They carried goods wrapped in silk and bronze, but more than that, they carried tales. "We've heard of your village," one of them said, setting down a chest of carved shells. "They say it's a place where the gods no longer rule, where people live by their own truth." An elder of Stenvik, gray-bearded and bent, nodded slowly. "We remember the gods, but we no longer kneel to them." The trader smiled. "Then you are ahead of the world. Many still fight wars for the favor of unseen hands." The villagers offered them food and rest, and as they sat by the fire that night, the traders spoke of faraway lands, of empires rising and falling, of temples drowned by floods, of kings who claimed divine blood yet could not escape death. The people of Stenvik listened quietly, knowing that in all those stories lay the same truth: power fades, but memory endures. The next morning, before the traders departed, they asked to see the Seacliff Shrine. When they stood before the wooden figures, they bowed their heads. "These," one whispered, "are not idols. They are mirrors." And so the story spread further, carried in the words of those who sailed away, of a northern village where men and women lived without fear, where a woman's defiance had remade faith itself. Across the coasts and fjords, her name began to return: Astrid of Stenvik, the storm's daughter, the woman who defied Odin and lived. Generations passed. The world beyond changed in ways the first villagers could never have imagined. Kings came and went, new faiths rose, promising salvation in gentler tongues but carrying the same hunger for devotion. Yet in the far north, the people of Stenvik remained. They did not reject those who came with new gods or new ways. They simply listened, nodded, and returned to their stories. For they had learned the one truth the gods never wanted men to know: that divinity is not a gift from above, but a strength found within. On midsummer nights, when the sky refused to darken, the villagers gathered by the shore, lighting torches that flickered like stars against the sea. They sang songs in soft, winding melodies, not hymns, but stories turned to sound. The children would toss flowers into the waves, laughing, calling to Astrid as though she might answer. And when the wind rose from the water, carrying the scent of salt and memory, they swore they heard her voice among the waves, faint, almost human, but filled with a quiet joy. One evening, an elder named Svala, a descendant of Ingrid, sat by the fire, her hair silver as frost. Around her gathered the children, their faces lit with the orange glow of flame. "Tell us the true story," they begged. "Not the one from the songs. Tell us what really happened." Svala smiled, her eyes reflecting the fire. "No one knows the whole truth," she said. "The gods do not speak it, and neither do men. But I can tell you what was remembered." And she told them of Astrid, the child who stood in the storm, of her defiance before the priest, of the lightning that spared her, of the raven that never left her side. She told of how the village had turned away from fear and learned to see itself as its own source of strength. The children listened in silence, wide-eyed, until one whispered, "Was she afraid?" Svala paused, staring into the flames. Yes, she said softly. Everyone who stands against gods is afraid. But she walked through her fear, and that's why her name still lives. When the story ended, the children sat quietly, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, and the sea murmured beyond the cliffs. Svala looked out into the darkness and whispered, "She's still out there, watching the tide. Waiting for those who will listen." That night, when the village slept, a storm gathered on the horizon, not fierce but alive. Lightning flickered far out to sea, and for a brief moment, a figure seemed to stand within it, her hair streaming like flame, her eyes calm and knowing. The storm passed without rain, but in its wake, the air carried a strange peace, as though the world itself had exhaled. By morning, the sea was still. The raven, long unseen, returned, perching atop the weathered figures by the shore. It cried once, sharp and echoing, before taking flight toward the rising sun. The villagers took it as a sign, not of warning, but of remembrance renewed. They rebuilt the figures that spring, replacing the worn wood with new carvings, made by many hands. Each person shaped a piece, adding their own mark, a story, a symbol, a name. When the work was done, they stood back to see the new forms gleaming in the morning light. The faces were the same and yet different, shaped by countless memories bound together. And as the tide came in, washing over the stones, the waves caught the reflection of those wooden faces, calm, unbowed, eternal. The people of Stenvik watched in silence, and for a moment every heart there understood. The story had never truly been Astrid's alone. It was theirs and always would be. Years drifted onward like the tide, each one carrying away a little of the old world and leaving behind something quieter, more human. The people of Stenvik had long since ceased to speak of gods and prophecies. Their faith had settled into the rhythm of life itself, in the turning of the seasons, the birth of children, the gathering of harvests, the slow, steady beat of the waves against the shore. The great dramas of men and gods had become stories for winter nights, told not to inspire awe, but to remind them of what had been overcome. Still, the memory of Astrid lingered like salt in the air, not as a myth, not as a saint, but as something woven into the land. Her name had become part of the language itself. When a storm gathered on the horizon, the villagers would say softly, "Astrid is walking again." When someone found courage to speak against injustice or fear, they would murmur, "She remembers you." These words carried no superstition. They were a kind of poetry, born from gratitude. The world beyond their fjord had grown louder. Travelers now came more frequently, bringing news of kingdoms rising and falling, of faiths spreading like wildfire, of wars waged in the name of new gods. But even as the world changed, Stenvik remained an island of calm. Some mocked them for their simplicity, others envied their peace. To those who came seeking miracles, the villagers offered none. They only said, "We have learned to live without needing them." The descendants of Ingrid and Astrid became keepers of the oral histories. Each generation added something. A phrase, a song, a small truth passed like a whisper from one lifetime to the next. No scroll or stone could hold it all, only memory could. In time, the tale became less about defiance and more about balance. It was no longer the story of a woman who challenged gods, but of a people who learned to live freely under the same sky that once terrified them. One summer, an old scholar arrived, a man from the far south, stooped and weary, carrying a leather-bound book. He came not to trade, but to listen. The villagers welcomed him as they did all travelers. He stayed for weeks, moving quietly from home to home, recording their stories by the hearth. One evening, sitting with Svala's granddaughter, he asked, "Do you believe she was real?" The woman smiled. "If by real you mean flesh and bone, yes, once. But if you mean whether she still walks among us, perhaps not in the way you think." He frowned slightly. "Then what remains?" She gestured toward the sea. "The question she asked. The courage she left behind. Those things are more real than bodies." The scholar nodded slowly, closing his book. "Then I suppose the gods did not win after all." "No," she said, her voice soft but sure. "They simply faded." And maybe that was mercy. When he departed, he left a copy of his notes with the villagers. A gift, he said, for their keeping. But they never read it aloud. They preferred the story in their own voices, unbound by ink or parchment. Years passed into decades, and the faces of those who had once known Astrid disappeared one by one into memory. The wooden figures by the shore weathered and cracked, yet still stood upright, their eyes turned toward the horizon. The raven never returned, but sometimes a shadow would cross the cliffs at dusk, and the children would point, saying, "She's flying home." A new generation grew, unafraid of storms. They no longer offered prayers when thunder rolled. Instead, they stood outside and watched, marveling at the raw beauty of the sky. To them, lightning was not wrath. It was creation, light breaking through darkness, proof that even chaos could be beautiful. One of these children, a girl with hair the color of frost and eyes like the northern sea, became a storyteller. Her name was Edda, and though she never met Ingrid or Astrid, she spoke as if she had. Each night, she gathered the villagers around the hearth and retold the story, not word for word, but as something living. Her version began not with the gods, but with the storm. "There was a time," she would say, "when people feared the sky. And then one woman stood in its light and did not bow." Her listeners would sit quietly, watching the fire flicker across her face, and in her voice, they heard echoes of those who came before, Ingrid's wisdom, Astrid's defiance, Svala's calm strength. The story was not a lesson anymore. It was a memory of courage made gentle through time. One evening, as she finished the tale, an old man asked her, "Do you think she ever found peace?" Edda smiled faintly. "Peace isn't something you find. It's something you leave behind." That night, she walked to the cliffs where the sea met the sky. The stars were scattered like silver dust, and the aurora shimmered faintly on the horizon. She sat on the cold stone and listened to the wind, the water, the quiet pulse of the world. Somewhere in that vastness, she thought she heard a voice, not words, but the rhythm of a heartbeat carried by the waves. In that moment, she understood. Astrid's defiance had not been against the gods, but against the silence they demanded. She had given voice to humanity, flawed, fleeting, but full of wonder. And that voice had never stopped echoing. When dawn came, the first light touched the sea in soft gold. The tide rose and fell like breathing. The wooden figures caught the sun, their worn faces glowing faintly. The village stirred awake, unaware of the eternity quietly unfolding around them. Life would go on, as it always had, but in every act of kindness, in every question spoken aloud, in every heart that chose wonder over fear, a part of her remained. The gods were gone. The world had changed. Yet the story, her story, endured, whispered on the wind that swept across the northern sea, patient and eternal as the tide. Centuries passed, and the memory of Astrid, the woman who had defied Odin, slipped quietly from the living world into legend. Kingdoms rose and fell, languages changed, and faiths crossed oceans, but in the northern lands her story persisted, not in temples or scrolls, but in the mouths of wanderers and the songs of those who still listened to the wind. The old sagas called her the storm's daughter, though others named her the one who questioned the sky. Scholars dismissed her as myth, priests called her a warning, and yet, among the forgotten fjords, there were those who whispered that truth lives longest when it is doubted. By the time the age of axes had given way to the age of ink, few remembered where Stenvik once stood. The fjord was there still, but time had softened its cliffs, and the sea had reclaimed much of the old land. Only fragments remained, a scatter of stones beneath the moss, the faint outline of foundations buried beneath grass. To the unknowing traveler, it was nothing. But to those who paused and listened, it felt as though the air itself remembered. The wind that brushed across the ruins carried a strange calm, as if 1,000 untold prayers still lingered there. One autumn, a young historian named Leif ventured north, guided by a half-torn map and the words of his grandmother, who had told him stories of a woman who had once defied the gods themselves. He did not believe in myths, but he believed in echoes, in the way truth hides beneath the dust of centuries. He traveled by boat, his oars cutting through gray water, the cold air filling his lungs with every stroke. When he reached the fjord, he found nothing but silence. No village, no statues, only the endless whisper of the tide. He camped on the shore that night, beside a small fire. The sky above was vast and untouched by light, a cathedral of stars. Leif felt both humbled and seen beneath it. As he lay awake, the wind rose from the sea, low and mournful, carrying with it a sound like distant singing. He told himself it was the wind through the rocks. Yet, deep down, he knew it was something older, something remembering itself. In the morning, he explored the cliffs. Beneath the frost and roots, he uncovered a fragment of wood, smooth and blackened by age. It was the corner of a carved figure, a weathered face gazing upward, eyes open as if in defiance of the heavens. His breath caught. This was no idol of Odin, nor of any known god. The face was human, serene, resolute, eternal. He carried it to his camp and studied it until dusk. The carving was rough, yet filled with a strange tenderness. Whoever made it had known reverence, but not for divinity, for memory. Leif traced the lines of the face with his thumb and whispered softly, "Astrid." The name felt unfamiliar on his tongue, yet it warmed the air around him. That night, the aurora unfolded like silk across the heavens, green, violet, gold, shifting, breathing, alive. The light painted the sea and cliffs in otherworldly colors, and in that shimmering glow, Leif felt a presence, not as vision or voice, but as knowing. He understood then what his grandmother had meant when she said, "The gods fade, but courage does not." He stayed there for 3 days, recording what he found, though he knew history would never take it seriously. When he returned south, his colleagues dismissed his words as poetic exaggeration. "A myth," they said. "You went looking for ghosts and found the wind." But years later, when Leif grew old, he returned once more to the north, not as a historian, but as a pilgrim. He brought no tools, no notebooks, no questions. Only silence. The fjord welcomed him like an old friend. The sea was calm, the air soft with the scent of rain. He placed the carved fragment back upon the stone where he had found it, now cleaned and wrapped in linen, and whispered, "You were never a myth." As he turned to leave, the tide rose higher than before, washing over the stone and the carving. For a moment, it seemed as though the sea had swallowed it completely. But when the water receded, the figure stood upright once more, glistening under the gray light, unchanged, eternal. And then he heard it, a single raven's call echoing across the cliffs. He looked up, and there it was, dark wings cutting through the mist, circling once before vanishing into the horizon. Leif smiled faintly, his breath catching in his chest. "So you do remember," he murmured. He did not tell anyone what he saw. Some truths, he had learned, are not meant to be proven, only kept. When he died, his journal was found, filled with sketches of the fjord, notes of the strange calm that lingered there, and one final line scrawled across the last page. "The gods are quiet now." But somewhere in the northern wind, a woman still walks, her eyes turned toward the dawn. Years later, travelers still visit the coast, drawn by whispers of the lost village. Most find nothing. But some, those who come without expectation, speak of the same stillness, the same pull, as if the land itself is breathing around them. They say the sea glows faintly at night, a pale light moving beneath the water like the shimmer of wings. No one knows if Astrid ever truly became myth or memory. Perhaps she was both, a mortal who defied the divine, and in doing so, became something greater than either. Her story endured not because of her defiance, but because of what it awakened, a reminder that even in the face of endless night, humanity will always seek the light. So the wind continues to move through the fjords, carrying her name like a secret prayer. Not as worship, but as remembrance. Not as warning, but as promise. And in that quiet space between sea and sky, where the world seems to pause and listen, her story lives on, eternal, unfinished, waiting for the next voice brave enough to speak it aloud. And so the saga drifts endlessly through time, carried on breath and silence alike. No temple bears her name, no scripture binds her memory, yet she endures in the pause between waves, in the hush before dawn. Those who dream beside the northern sea sometimes whisper that they feel her watching, not as goddess or ghost, but as the echo of defiance that shaped the human spirit. The gods have long since vanished into dust, but Astrid's question remains, eternal and tender as the tide. What does it mean to be free beneath a sky that once demanded fear? And so, the story comes full circle, not as an ending but as a return. The sea still breathes, the wind still carries her name, and somewhere beyond sight, Astrid still walks between worlds, not as goddess, nor ghost, but as the quiet reminder that courage never dies. Her defiance became our inheritance, her voice our conscience, her silence our peace. Time may bury names, rewrite faiths, and fade all empires, but the spirit that once stood against the storm endures. In every question whispered to the night, she answers still, not in thunder, but in calm.